the whole title of the show and the whole idea of the show is about losing things. And the clever twist with that title is to call it The Biggest Loser. Normally, the person who loses biggest, he or she is going to be in bad shape. To lose things is bad. Right, generally that's the way we think of it. We don't like to lose things, especially not big things. But, as you know, if you've ever been on a weight loss program or you've ever watched The Big Loser, there are some things we need to lose. Because if we don't lose them, they're going to cause us a lot of unnecessary problems. They'll make life harder for us and ultimately for the people around us. And I wonder what sort of things you need to lose. All of us, well, majority of us, it wouldn't hurt to lose a pound or two. But what about some things that are really more important than that, things that go much deeper than that? Some people need to lose an attitude. Other people need to lose some of their self-defeating behaviors, things they do repeatedly, over and over, that are self-destructive, mess their lives up, and the lives of anybody who's closely connected to them gets hurt. Another thing that's good for some people to lose, this one will be a little harder. Some people need to lose their position and some of their possessions. Why? Well, for one thing, position, especially a really high position, can become a source of great pride. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for high positions. Don't misunderstand me. We need godly people in high positions. But I've seen godly people in high positions who got intoxicated with the power of that, the influence of that, the ego trip of it all. I've not been in any super high positions, but I know the highest position I've ever been in eventually started building too much ego in me. And I began basing way too much of my self-worth on having that position. Some of us would actually be better off if we just lost that position. We'd be better off to lose some possessions. You know, on The Biggest Loser, the bigger the person is, the more they have to lose. Well, the more you got. In terms of possessions, the more you got to lose. The more you got to worry with. And also, the more things you have to distract you from the things that matter most in life, like your relationship with God and with your family and good Christian friends. A lot of things we could all stand to use. And there were some things that Joseph needed to lose. I'm talking about the Old Testament Joseph. Joseph, the one with the coat of many colors. Joseph, the son of Jacob. There was a boy who had a lot to lose. He was the son of a very wealthy man. His great-grandfather was Abraham. Abraham was so wealthy in livestock that the land could not even support him and his nephew, and so they had to go separate directions. That many possessions. Abraham passed it on down to his son Isaac, who also kept the family business going, kept the wealth, preserved it, managed it well, did a good job. Then came Jacob. He not only received a good inheritance, he probably doubled it or tripled it because he was a tremendous businessman. Not always honest, at least not early in his life, but he knew how to swing a deal, and he made a lot of good ones. So his sons, his 12 sons, who, as you know, became the 12 tribes of Israel, their descendants became the 12 tribes of Israel. They had a lot. They were born with a lot. And they had a lot to lose. When you see the position they had early in the book of Genesis, say around chapter 37, where we're going to be today, and you see how much they had, it is really hard to imagine that within another 2 or 3 generations, they would not merely be broke, they would be slaves. They had a lot to lose. They eventually lost it all, but that's a different sermon all in itself. All I really need to draw from that is that Joseph was the favorite son. Of all the 12 sons, Joseph was by far the favorite. There was no question about it. The reason was he was the firstborn son of Jacob's favorite wife, which made him Jacob's favorite. And so while they all had a lot, Joseph got the special treatment. That's what the coat of many colors was all about. The idea behind this coat, the thing about this coat that bothered his brothers so bad is that this was not a work coat. It was not a Carhartt. It was a North Face. It was a sport coat, something you'd wear to a party. It's not what you wear out in the field. And that sent a very clear message to everybody. All the brothers got it. They understood it. And only one of them liked it that way. That was Joseph. The others, not quite so excited. I want you to look at what I'm talking about in Genesis. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They could not say a kind word to him. Now, there's a lot of people we can dislike and still manage to smile and speak to in Walmart. But when you can't even say a kind word to them, faking it, you hate them pretty bad. That's the way Joseph's brothers felt about him. And there was one other factor there that I need to mention, and that is how Joseph achieved this favored position. He was on the top of the ladder. They were all down below. Was it because Joseph had worked harder than the others? In fact, he had not done a whole lot of work at all. Was it because he worked smarter? No, he didn't work smart. He was apparently a little bit of a smart aleck, but he was not a smart worker. He was in that position for the kind of reason that everybody instinctively resents. He got that position because he got favored treatment. That's all. He did nothing to earn that position. And the problem with not working our way up to the position we're in, is that God has so designed the world to where the process of growing and improving and learning, getting better and better and better through hardships, difficulties, stresses at work, all of that, that's the way we learn. That's what makes us better at whatever it is we do. But what happens when you take a person who just bypasses all of that and you make them president? That's what happened with Joseph. And so Joseph had a whole lot he needed to lose, see. Joseph needed to lose a very unrealistic expectation, and he was going to lose that one the hard way, buddy. He had this expectation that a lot of folks today have. He had this expectation that other people were there to take care of him. Other people were there to serve him. Whereas Jesus would later teach, no, it's just the opposite. Whoever wants to be the greatest among you, let him be the servant of all. And all great leaders are servant leaders. Joseph needed to lose that. It was a very self-defeating attitude that was going to get him in a lot of trouble. Another thing he needed to lose was his pride. He had a lot of ego wrapped up in his coat and his position. And he loved to make himself look good by making his brothers look bad. Now, is Joseph the only dude that ever enjoyed that one? That played that game? I don't think there's anybody in the room who's not done that in one way or another at one time or another. We try to make ourselves look better or feel better by making someone else look bad or feel bad. Lot to lose. And sure enough, when you got that much to lose, it's just a matter of time before you lose it. Joseph lost his only 2 verses later. Verse 26 of Genesis chapter 37. Setting, the brothers are out in the fields. Father Jacob sends his favorite to go check on them. Make sure they're working. Make sure they're not cheating on the time clock. Make sure they're not cutting corners, Joseph. You go check them out. And Joseph loved that job. There's a little bit of Joseph in all of us that loves those kind of jobs. The job of checking up on other people and reporting to everyone else how they're doing, especially when they're not doing well. Well, it didn't go well, though, for Joseph. Look at what the Bible says. They saw him coming, and they took him when he arrived. They snatched off that coat of many colors, and they threw him into a pit that was basically a dry well. No water, but may have been some mud at the bottom just to make it a little more miserable. And they had Joseph in this pit. They were trying to decide what they were going to do with him, whether to kill him or to, I don't know what else. But Judah arrived. Judah, one of the 12 brothers, said to his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders." For they saw a caravan headed down into Egypt. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood, and his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver, and the traders took him to Egypt. There in Egypt, Joseph got to feel what it's like to be a loser for the very first time. In fact, his first loss was finding himself at the bottom of that pit, looking up, helpless to get out. His father's too far away to come and save him. There's nobody to help him. And now he's at the mercy of these boys he's been messing with for so long. Getting a taste of loss. But it got worse. He became a slave down in Egypt. He was a slave for a certain time, but it got worse. Now, I'm going to tell you something. It's bad to get fired from your job. I mean, that's bad. I would feel bad if y'all just fired me. But when you get fired from being a slave, how can you get much lower? I mean, where do you go from there? Well, there was one step lower, and God so arranged that Joseph took that lower step and wound up in prison, a dungeon. Once again, down in a pit, literally in a pit. It would have been damp. It would have been dirty. And there would have been a lot of fertilizer down there too. That's where Joseph found himself. It was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Yep, it was the worst thing that ever happened to Joseph. You know what else? It was also the very best thing that ever happened to Joseph. Because down there in that dungeon, with all that dirt, with all that dampness, and with all that fertilizer, something began to grow. And that something was Joseph himself. He began to grow like a green vine, like Jack's beanstalk. Slowly, slowly. At first, almost unnoticeable. Up, 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 until it grew through the bars of the dungeon and reached out into the open sunlight. What do I mean by that? I mean that the whole time Joseph was down in that dungeon, he had to recognize and accept the fact that he had lost all those things that he'd been trusting in his entire life. And he was never going to get any of them back. And sure enough, he didn't. If he had become a bitter, sour-spirited, life's not fair kind of boy, you and I would never have heard of him again. There'd be a big block of material missing from the book of Genesis. And I don't know what would have happened to the children of Israel, the sons of Israel, 20 years later when a famine hit and they had nothing to eat, nowhere to go but to go down into Egypt, where they met Joseph, who'd now risen up through the ranks and was second in command. This time, though, he wasn't put there because of a favor. By the way, if you don't know this story real well, I'm skipping some stuff for the sake of time. Let me just let it suffice to say that Joseph refused to get bitter when he lost everything. He was determined to get better. And rather than turning against God, he turned to God. He looked up, and that's the direction he began to grow. The direction you're looking is the direction your life's going to go. You spend a lot of time looking down? Or do you spend time looking up? He looked up, up, up. He worked hard. He worked smart. All the things he used to not do because he didn't have to do them. You get that? He didn't do them because he didn't have to do them. Oh my goodness. At our heart, there's a kernel of laziness in every one of us. It's in there. We just don't all allow it to grow and take over. But almost anybody who is not required to work, who's not forced to deal with difficult situations because there's always somebody to bail them out. Those people, they're not going to ever really work on themselves or contribute much of anything to anybody. We grow. You know when we grow? When we really start moving toward maturity, when we have no other choice. Or let me put it this way. When we get so low and we're in such a down and out state that we find ourselves looking at only one or two choices. I can either grow or I can lay here and die. I've been there. Have you? I'm here today because I chose growth over death. Which are you going to choose? There was a time in my life when I was a pastor at First Baptist Muskogee, Oklahoma. These two ladies, Lori and Becky down front, just popped in to visit us. They're from that church up in Oklahoma. And that was a mighty good 10 years. Good in almost every way. I do not say this to be showing out. I say it simply so you'll understand where I'm going. I mean, I was not Joel Osteen or Billy Graham. No, I wasn't on TV. But for that town, in that town, I had a good reputation. I was respected. We grew a big church. I got a lot of praise. I got a lot of affirmation. A lot of people looking up to me, and I got addicted to that. I always knew I was prone to it. And so I began to pray the last year or two that I was there. I began to realize, Lord, actually it wasn't me really actually realizing it on my own. It's that as I opened and was willing to listen, he began to show me that a lot of what I was doing, a lot of the good that I was doing was being done for the wrong reasons. At the very least, there were mixed motives. That my desire to preach my very, very best was, yes, it was partly because I wanted to reach people as best I could, but it was also so I could keep the show rolling. And I knew something was wrong with that. And I began to pray, God, take that away. Break that. I don't know what it'll take, but please, break it. You see, all of us need to be broken before God can reform us into what he wants us to be. Do you know that until we're broken in some way, we are sort of like a mason jar full of seeds, tightly sealed, kept at room temperature, safely up on the top shelf where nothing's going to happen to it. The seeds are potential that's just not yet being used. But if we are fortunate, if we are so blessed, you know what God will do? He will just walk up and tap that jar off the top shelf, and it will smash on the ground below, and the seed will scatter everywhere, and it'll appear that all is lost. See, that's what happened to Joseph down in that dungeon where it was so moist and dirty and well fertilized. And that seed in Joseph began to grow in a way it never would have back at his father's house with all that comfort and protection. Until then, he was a mason jar full of seeds that had potential but were doing nothing. Had to have his jar broken. God ever broken your jar? For many of us, he has to break it 2 or 3 times. In fact, he may have to keep breaking those jars over and over until we finally get it. So if I've got a broken jar right now, the sooner I learn this lesson he's trying to teach me, the sooner I can get in the dirt, get the dirty work over with, and start becoming, growing like that vine, growing like Joseph, who grew so much. He grew so much that 20 years later, when he found himself in a position of power that he himself really did work for, get this now, his brothers showed up. They showed up down in Egypt in line, wanting to buy corn so they wouldn't starve. And the Bible says that Joseph immediately recognized his brothers. They did not recognize him. You know one reason he immediately recognized them? Is because they'd really not changed. You can recognize somebody after 20 years unless they've changed so drastically that you'd hardly know them. Joseph had changed that drastically. Now, I'm not just talking about outward appearance. That's just the crust level. Basically, I'm saying those boys had pretty much the same kind of character they'd had years earlier. But Joseph was so radically different, they didn't recognize him. And yes, he had on probably one of those Pharaoh hats and a lot of gold and maybe a shaved Yul Brynner head. I don't know. But I do know this. They didn't recognize him because he had grown so. And I want you to think back 20 years, if you've been around that long. If you compare who you are right now, the way you operate right now, the way your mind works right now, your attitudes right now, your behavior patterns, whether they be positive and healthy and successful, or whether they are still self-defeating, continuing. 20 years ago and now, are there significant differences? I hope that 20 years from now, you will have matured, grown, thrived spiritually, and in every other way so much that people who know you now will meet you then and say, "What happened?" This is amazing. Only God could have done that. Only God can make stuff like that happen. But God only makes stuff like that happen in the lives of people who let it happen, who cooperate with Him when the jar breaks. Cooperate with Him and grow. You need to thank God for the busted jars. And instead of placing those jars so carefully on a shelf somewhere and trying to keep from losing them, lose some of them on purpose. Simplify. Be a big loser.